Hey everyone, welcome back to 6 Degrees of Associations. We have Nathan Victoria joining us today. I want to give a shout out to Joanna Pineda. She's the CEO and Chief Troublemaker at Matrix Group, who told us we had to meet Nathan. So here we are. Nathan, how did you find the association world? What do you do? And let's just get started there, man.
Absolutely. So, like many of us, I fell into the association world. So, I was a graduate student that was moving to DC because my partner was moving to DC. Nonprofit salary, lawyer salary. So clearly, we were moving to DC for him. And what was a failed summer internship application turned into a part-time job, turned into two part-time jobs, turned into them creating a role for me at NASPA, which is a organization for student affairs administrators. So the non-academic side of college life. At NASPA, I had 7 different roles over 13 years there, and 6 of those roles I created. As far as who I am and what I am, so first, I'm a father and a husband. So I have 3 rambunctious children, a 9-year-old, a 2.5-year-old, and a 1.5-year-old. We were supposed to only have 2, and then a third one, all adopted. We can go in that a little bit, Casey, if that's relevant. Currently, I'm the vice president of NextGen Association Management Company. We are a boutique firm founded in 2020, but I came over to the organization in June of last year, so almost a year. Brought over my main client, which is the Society for Personality Assessment, which I started at the organization in May of 2020. So fun time to be starting at an association. Additionally, I serve as the chief administrative lead for the National Council for Investigative and Security Services, so private detectives. And I'm currently the interim CEO for the Environmental Design Research Association. So that is another group that we're on a kind of part-time interim appointment. There's today, actually, while we're recording, there we'll be hearing back from I think 3 other organizations as far as next steps. So NextGen's moving and shaking. We've gotten 3 new clients in just the past year. So excited to be here and chat with you.
You're juggling a lot as the vice president of NextGen Association Management Company. So there's a million directions we can go in. However, you starting the conversation out by associating your identity as a family person is no mistake. I am guessing I am a father as well. That is the first, husband, father. That is what I am. Everything else is etc. Right? So tell me about that. Tell me about what the kids are up to, how you balance it all, what that looks like before we jump into a lot of the other things I want to ask you about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of probably the themes that we'll have today, Casey, is that it's all connected for me. So one of the things that NextGen in particular and the owner, founder and president, TJ Cote, who I know through the DELP program through ASAE, is we're family first. And I think that's one of the things that why I'm excited to work with TJ and grow the company. But in particular for me, there's not really this kind of traditional separation of professional and personal life that I think tends to come up. I'm a doctoral candidate in human and organizational learning at the George Washington University. And I'm looking at how racially minoritized volunteer leaders navigate whiteness within their professional associations. And whiteness for me is power, privilege, the maintenance of norms. And I'm using a theoretical foundation that kind of spells that out a little bit more. But, I think one of the things that came up in my study was this concept of personal and professional blending. And if you think about the separation when it used to be in the 50s and the 60s, it was traditionally a white man who had a stay-at-home wife who could deal with the parent or the children or the family or all of those sorts of things. As an elder millennial that has my mother-in-law living with us and then the 3 kids, we're navigating this constant navigation. And I think for me, there isn't that separation. So for me, I am a dad first. I discourage my volunteers when they apologize for, oh, sorry that my kid's here, or, sorry I had to take care of whatever. No, we're humans first. And I think that's one of the pieces that I think is really important. As far as the kids, so the oldest, Maggie, she's in 3rd grade. So she is biologically my husband's niece. We had 3 days notice to adopt her. There were some drug issues in the family, and found out about her Friday morning. Decided that we were going to adopt her on Saturday. My husband's brother and girlfriend at the time needed to place her. They had 2 kids of their own, couldn't take on a third. So we were in Target at 8 a.m. buying, lots of stuff. And we got the wrong kind of car seat. So I had to go to Babies R Us while we were at the hospital. But because it was a family adoption, we took Maggie home like she was our birth child. So there was no paperwork. Aaliyah, who is our second, we went through a traditional process, but started during COVID, or right before COVID. So I think for us, it ended up being a not actually too long of a wait, but the process of filling out the paperwork and doing all those things took about 4 years. But we were only in waiting for maybe 7 months, I think, actually, before we were placed. All open adoptions. So Kristen is the birth mom, Dennis is the birth dad. We were actually in the birth room when Aaliyah was born. We held her legs. I cut the umbilical cord for Aaliyah. We were done. Well, my husband was done. I was open to a third at our social workers closeout for our visitation once Aaliyah was placed with us. He's like, so when's number 3? Joking, because he knew my husband was done, knew that I was wishy-washy. And my husband, who willed Miles to happen, Miles is our boy, said, well, if Kristen got pregnant again with Dennis and it were a boy, like maybe we'd be open. Kristen got pregnant again with Dennis and it was a boy. We only had a month notice for Miles. We found out on December 8th. We took the weekend to decide. And, Casey, the easiest way for us to put it, or it might not make sense, but maybe for parents out there wasn't a good reason to not say no. Yes, we would have less money. We already had 2 kids. We'd have less, like all of the things. But, Miles was born healthy, and he wanted to give us the full experience. So he was C-section, actually. So my husband cut that umbilical cord, artificially after the surgeons cut it. But then we also had to have a NICU stay because he wasn't breathing too great. So he got us a little bit of rest. But it's a rambunctious house. They're all in their respective places. My mother-in-law was watching the 2 younger ones when they first popped out, but they're both in daycare, and then Maggie's in 3rd grade, as I mentioned.
Incredible story. Love the fact that you were open to 3. I have 2 right now, and the thought of introducing a 3rd, not gonna lie, that's another reason that I might be tossing and turning at night, because we have our hands full right now with 2 ages, about to be 4, about to be 1. So okay. Yeah, I get what that goes into that. Go ahead.
Yeah, honestly, so Maggie's 6 years in between there's 6 years in between Aaliyah and Maggie. So Maggie's actually very helpful. Like, especially with Miles, like she would hold the bottle, she'd be able to pick him up. I mean, nice. He's a tank now, so he's 36 pounds as a 15-month-old. So he is 99 percentiles plus. Oh, wow. But the age gap actually helped. And personally, and it might just be the ages for us, I actually thought 0 to 1 was the hardest.
Yeah.
1 to 2 was then harder or less hard than that. And 2 to 3 actually hasn't been as bad as yes, I'm not saying, so man-to-man zone, like, yes, there's absolutely difference. But I think because it's already chaos, you just kind of lean into that a little bit more. And it is.
And you have support from your mother-in-law, I'm assuming, who lives with you. Correct. And your spouse as well. You have to have some sort of tag team situation going on there. Tell me about the meeting you just came off of in Toronto. Selfishly, I'd love to learn more about balancing travel with the home life, because it's a reality for a lot of us in the association space. We're going to different conferences left and right.
Absolutely. I think for us, travel was one of those pieces that my husband in his previous roles wasn't traveling as much. So I was the one that, quote unquote, got the escape. So I think the fact that he's traveling now more actually has created a more equitable relationship for the 2 of us. Because now I have to deal with being a solo. I was a solo parent this whole week, actually. So he had a staff retreat. And, I had to be the ones doing the mid-morning and early mornings and late nights, et cetera. So SPA, so again, the Society for Personality Assessment, it's about 1,100, members. And we're specifically focused on psychological assessment. So if you've ever heard of the Rorschach Inkblot test by Herman Rorschach, that's actually what we were founded as in the 1920s, 1930s. So we're not the Myers-Briggs pop culture Facebook, are you an elephant or are you a giraffe sort of personality assessment. We're much more on the clinical and psychological side. Our members do psychological assessment for fit for trial cases. A lot of people in the military are high risk cases. So every air traffic controller must take a personality assessment before they're kind of fit to go in those places. But we also have members that have done personality assessment for reality TV, for the Red Sox. So a lot of draftees, again, you think about these investments that these people are placing in, they want to have a psychological profile of the attendees. It was the first time that we were ever across the border. So again, we've been around for almost 80 years. And, I think when I was sourcing, so I am the sourcer for the organization. When I was sourcing last cycle, I was like, if we're going to be international, let's actually be international and go across. About 10% of our members are outside of the United States. It was a really successful meeting. I think, unfortunately, there was less graduate students. We knew this going in. Due to the political environment right now, graduate students shared with us that they did not feel comfortable not going to Canada, but potentially coming back. In particular, our international graduate students. We did see, though, a higher increase in Canadian and international members compared to other meetings. I will say the one thing, and shout out to Business Events Canada, that it financially was a very successful conference. The Canadian government has rebates back to us for taxes going back to the organization, the exchange rate for things. So, overall, mind you, Toronto is a great city, easy flight. We were at the end of March. Our weather actually was decent. It was in the 30s and 40s degrees. When I left, it was 70 or 68, I think. But really successful. And I think like every other kind of association professional that's out there, your meeting is that one time to get to meet people, to further engage. And I think for our board, we had some really, I'll keep them confidential for now, but really interesting conversations about, the future of our field, the future of the organization. And, you can't get that virtually. Yes, we did have a virtual component for those that aren't able to attend, but, I really do think there is something about that face-to-face. And, as far as travel, I think I'm fortunate that the kids, the 9-year-old, the 8-year-old, 9-year-old kind of gets it now. This was the first time the 2.5-year-old kind of understood I left. So apparently she was pretty sad when I was gone. But obviously for us now, FaceTime and, those ways we can digitally stay together. And I think in particular for, our generation, Casey, not sure how old you are, but I'll put us roughly in the same, age range. They sometimes become family vacations. You don't want me to break the news. So we'll be in Long Beach next year. It's actually over my daughter's spring break. I didn't plan it that way, just happened to be that way. But, Disneyland is right down the road. So the plan is just to bring the whole family out. And, I think as I was talking about personal and professional, I'm not ashamed that my daughter's there. Obviously, I'm there to work, and she understands that. But, our conference chair brought his 10-month-old. And his wife. So I am seeing, and I don't know how much our generation is kind of changing what we think of work travel and tacking on things, but I did notice probably 4 babies under 1 or so at this conference. And, mom or dad is presenting their poster and maybe little one's there, maybe the other spouse has the baby. But, I am seeing that we are, again, trying to integrate our personal and professional lives a little bit more.
You've got to do it. If there's a lot to deliver as both a professional and as a family person. And obviously family comes first, but if you can meld the two and make it work, do it. And as the CEO of the Society for Personality Assessment, you have a strong say in selecting meeting sites. You mentioned the rebates in Canada. I'm not sure if that entered into the algorithm that helped you select Toronto. Great city, shout out, love Toronto. Although it's not a direct flight for me in Baltimore. That's my main airport, so I'll have to shoot down to DC. Boo-hoo.
I was like, it's not that far.
Yeah, exactly. Boo-hoo for me, right? So no, tell me about what goes into selecting the meeting site, though.
Absolutely. So we, we're SPAs at this interesting size where I'll do a little bit of industry speak for a moment. So we're 200 on peak or so, about 1,000 rooms overall for the contract. We try to keep our F&B around $60,000 or so. As far as decisions, where we were this year. So again, we just selected our next cycle. So 27 will be in Long Beach, 28 will be at the Boston Renaissance Seaport, and 29 will be at the Royal Sonesta in New Orleans. So for SPA personally, and the board is on board with this, I've really tried to get us outside of our typical cities. Not that Chicago isn't great. We ended up back in New Orleans. Not that San Diego isn't great. We were there in 24. So again, there are these places that SPA has traditionally gone to, but like we haven't been to the Pacific Northwest. So 2030, 2031, 32, probably when we source, we'll go there. So for me, some of it is the kind of the where we've been. We don't have a flow where we have to be east, middle, west, or whatever, like some organizations are. So I think that was one of the pieces. Two, it's about partnership. So I think really when I'm on site, I was told this, so maybe it is different, but when I was sourcing and viewing, I was just upfront with all of our hotels. I was like, hey, this is great. I need the F&B here, or otherwise we're probably going to walk. Hey, this is great, but these are the non-negotiables for the organization. I think the more seasoned generations sometimes were the art of the deal, where, you give this and then they get that, and then you give that. And I was like, why bleep around and really just think about, well, we want to be partners. Why don't we just be upfront now and then see if you'll be upfront? And again, that partnership, I can tell if they're not being upfront. So why not do that? I won't name the city, or location, but we were kind of promised an initial deal and then it got pulled back and we pulled out. I think it was an administrative error. I don't think they were really kind of playing the game, but it didn't work for us at that point. And it needs to be, and again, that's where it's partnership. We also need to understand that, well, maybe we need to come up in rate, or maybe we need to be flexible about our room sets, or those sorts of things. The other piece in particular for this sourcing pattern is finances. I think like many organizations, I was just with Travel Portland earlier this week, and they were saying they're seeing the pattern of sourcing change, where meetings of my size, so 400, 500 people, 200 on peak, are only doing it a year out. Then it's not this kind of longer where SPA does, we're sourced out through 29 now. I think for us in particular, what the board told me was we really need to look at finances. So for those of you that are either using third parties, or if you're doing it yourself, are you looking at rebates from the city? So we are in Boston at the end of February, early March. High need for Boston. We're getting, I think it's 10% back on our food and beverage and room rentals, just flat off because of that incentive from Visit Boston. I think it doesn't exist anymore, but that's one. Many of the cities are giving us rebates. So the CVB itself, so if you didn't know, the Convention and Visitors Bureaus sometimes have funding to encourage attendance. So if it is a high need time, they'll give a $5 or $10 rebate back off of the hotels. The hotels are also giving us a rebate off of these pieces. We've negotiated we can bring in outside AV. Love the companies, do a great job. We know the costs that are astronomical out there for AV. So we bring in our own AV company. They've been with SPA for almost 30 years now. And it's a significant, almost like 4 times savings, because we asked the in-house provider to give us a quote, and then we added our quote. I think it was like 3.5 times difference. Again, they didn't negotiate down, but don't negotiate. Give us initially what you want for a bid. And then the last piece, and I will say there are places out there for those of you sourcing now. We negotiated in free Wi-Fi. SPA was in Austin in 2023, San Diego in 24, Denver in 25. Our Wi-Fi bill, same bandwidth, same up down, was anywhere from $9,000 to $23,000. So that flexible of a bill, again, the SPA board told me, Nathan, we need to cut back costs. So one of this is trying to fix the costs as much as possible, as well as the rebates and the last things. The last piece I'll just put out there briefly, Casey, on kind of sourcing and whatnot, and SPA's approach is the current political climate. I know there are some organizations that, whether politically or philosophically, or I know at a time, California state schools weren't able to go to a list of 13 different states. because of that. As I mentioned, we went to Austin in 23, and we got a lot of pushback from some of our members, in particular from California, about, well, why are we going there, the current political climate, et cetera. We were fortunate that we actually had a SPA member, past president, out gay man, that talked about, well, what about us? What about us that are in this community, that are trying to make a change, that want to engage, but maybe don't have those travel funds? So there are some groups out there, and the name's escaping me right now. There are some groups out there that can support and help you engage and in local advocacy in the area. But what we decided to do was work with some local nonprofits, and instead of getting swag, so we took part of our swag budget, and every member got to have a $5 poker chip, and they got to pick from one of the 3 local nonprofits we were working with and donate to the local nonprofits. The local nonprofits were in our exhibit space, again, small tabletops, not huge, but it was a chance to engage the local community. And for me, that goes back to my NASPA days. So a lot of acronyms, we are in associations, but SB 1070 in Phoenix. So that was the Show Your Papers in 2009, when Indianapolis had a trans bathroom bill, Texas had another trans bathroom bill. NASPA's annual meeting was there. So again, what we chose to do was implicit or explicit activism in those spaces. And it started, our board chair at the time, her father was one of the first Latinx or Latino sheriffs in kind of one of the border towns in Texas. And what he taught her was, you don't run away from the fight, you go to where the work needs to get done. And I think that's what we as associations have the opportunity to do. Yes, there's statements of pulling out of cities. Yes, there's the economic kind of impact that does make. I also think there's privilege in being able to say that you're pulling out. So if you choose not to disengage from a city, or if you actively choose to go to a city, I think you can do intentional good and intentional networking. And if you choose to not go there, I think that it's not a either or. Like, I don't think there's a yes, we need to go, or no, we don't need to go. That it's much more nuanced than that. And I think there are opportunities, if you do decide to engage, to end up there. I think we're in California, Massachusetts, Louisiana. I mean, we'll see where the political environment is in a couple years. But again, SPA as an organization has a pretty set way of how we choose to engage, if we do end up going to a place that maybe politically doesn't align with our members. Last piece, that's also different though than safety. And I think that's part of the other part of the discussion we don't always have, that, in particular, when we were in Texas, like, one of our leaders was pregnant. And they talked about, and they were kind of further along in their trimester, and they talked about, like, they didn't go because, again, from a safety standpoint, Texas wasn't allowing certain reproductive rights. And if something were to happen and complications, they wouldn't be able to get the services they need. So, I can talk about activism. We can talk about going and being there. I think there's also the element and the kind of base element of safety, and also thinking about that as well.
And I want to add a footnote to that. You mentioned an organization that empowers attendees to offset the economic impact of the event in a city where local laws are not aligned with their values. That's social offset.
Thank you, Casey.
Yes, I was involved with actually producing a podcast at one point where the CEO of that organization was interviewed. So when you said it, it clicked. I would encourage people to definitely check them out. Social
Absolutely.
Offset. I'll put a link in the description for them. And so also you're involved heavily in the AANHPI community and group. That's a part of ASAE, if I'm not mistaken. We've had past guests, Joanna Pineda, who we mentioned earlier on the show, and of course, our dear friend, Wendy-Jo Toyama, CEO of the American Epilepsy Society. She's also very much involved in that organization. Tell us a little bit about that as we work towards wrapping up.
Yeah, absolutely. So ANHPI is one of the identity-based groups that ASE started, I think, about 3 years ago. It's one of those that when I started at ASAE, my first conference was 2009 in LA. So last year it was kind of trippy to be back in the same space. But it was my first conference, and Velma Hart was board chair or board chair elect, foundation board chair at the time. And Twitter was just starting to be a thing. So, I did social media. One of the jobs I created back in NASPA was social media. And I think I remember kind of going on, I was like, this is a really white space. And not necessarily in a negative way, but, I think they're just by white, again, and if I may, Casey, a little bit of my dissertation, by white, I mean the maintenance of norms. And this idea of there are just sometimes some things that we think about that are just normative within our society. So I interviewed 21 research participants. They were volunteer leaders that talked about experiences of whiteness within their professional associations. I used a methodology or a framework called CPAR, or Critical Participatory Action Research. And talks about the sayings, the doings, and the relatings, what we say, what we do, how we kind of interact with one another, and how they kind of create these interactions. So it seems silly and it seems stupid, but like one of the doings that came up was the concept of an agenda. So think about what an agenda can do. It can focus a conversation. It can say, hey, that's out of the agenda. Let's parking lot that. It can be this force thing that, no, it's not on there. For the person wielding the agenda, it can be this power move. And not that, again, we don't need an agenda, but are there ways to complicate that? Can we think about, well, how do we share the agenda beforehand? Instead of an agenda, I heard of the concept of a flow. So here's ideally where we're going to go today, but if we go down this rabbit hole, that's how it's meant to be. So why I bring up my dissertation in the ANHPI group. So the working title, I think it's going to end up changing, but I talk about this concept of a bayanihan, and this way of critical consciousness or making things more equitable. And it comes from the Filipino term, so identify as Filipino. This might be during, Asian American Heritage Month in May, depending on when production wraps up. But within the Filipino culture, there are these things called the bayan kubos, or those are kind of the traditional thatched houses back in the day. And it doesn't really translate to English. I asked my parents and relatives and around it, but there's this concept of bayanihan, or a community coming together to solve a problem. So what happens in the Philippines still is in some of these more remote, areas, they'll come together as a community, literally lift up the houses on bamboo stilts and move it to where it needs to go. And I think, how do we think about what we do in our work? How do we build communities? How are we building these spaces for our members, our groups to kind of move together? And I think that's been the really great thing about the ANHPI group. So I'm currently the kind of education chair, I think technically is the title. So we do micro-learning every month. So I'm responsible for kind of identifying speakers and whatnot. Wendy-Jo is the current chair, or she's about to roll off. So, I think it's been a group where I mentioned the Velma Hart and before, and being kind of the only one. It's been nice to kind of find this community, to see other people that look like me and kind of engage. I will say there's definitely different perspectives on that. We started a similar thing at SPA with lunches, and we've gotten mixed feedback from, in particular, some of our older members. I think, and that perhaps identify within those identities, because they feel it's a bit separatist, they feel it's a bit exclusive. At the same time, from our more junior members, they've said, this is the best part of the conference. I look forward to this every year. So partly my dissertation actually did find similar kind of feedback, where baby boomers kind of just conform to the system because that's how they feel like it needs to be. Gen Xers will conform, but they'll try to make it better for those that come after. Millennials, which identify, ultimately will conform, but we will be kicking and screaming and we'll tell you that we're conforming, and we're conforming for these reasons, again, to make sure that the change happens. And then I didn't have that many within Gen Z, but my feeling is kind of, they're like, F the system, I'm going to make my own way. And in some ways, it's admirable. Maybe they will be able to make that. But I personally think the system's too strong to kind of have that sort of revolution. But again, I think that's the piece but that's what's great, I think, about ASE, about these communities. It does bring together disparate thoughts. It brings together individuals that, have different perspectives, have different experiences. And, we can engage in conversation. And not that I need to necessarily agree with you, but I'm much more successful and beneficial, and I think better just because I'm hearing other perspectives. I think we're so often in our kind of echo chambers, unfortunately, and that is it's the hard thing at times. But I clearly identify more as a liberal, and I'm in a more conservative area. But I think to be able to have those conversations with my daughters and my son, and well, eventually with the daughter and son, they're still too young to fully get it. But, Maggie's asked about, well, why are girl clothes so tight? Why don't I have pockets? Why is this person being treated differently, or those sorts of things? And to be able to have those conversations with her, and I think that's ultimately, we talked about parenthood as that piece. I think associations have that power to make change in the world for the better. I think we as parents also have that responsibility. And I think so often we don't, it's easier to just ignore. I remember a white colleague of mine, when a lot of the racial justice stuff was happening in 2020, or no, it was before that. It was when I first had Maggie. And he's like, Nathan, isn't it cool that you could just like go home and ignore the outside world and like just be with your family? And I love it. I agree. And I think that's part of the problem, that we go back into our own networks and own echo chambers, and we don't try to engage across or outside. We don't try to kind of talk about the harder things. And ultimately, I think that's one of the pieces. Happy to connect with anyone afterwards, but just kind of wrap up the dissertation. So I'm like this close to defense, Casey. So that's why I'm like fully immersed and excited about it. But I think in looking at the data and looking at the recommendations, I think ultimately, so the sayings, doings, relatings, they create these bad places. And, I encourage us to think about, and what I'm calling the Bai Nihon, how do we catalyze change? How do we lead with love? And how do we leave a legacy? And kind of if we can do those sorts of pieces. So recognizing the system, or doing the dance of authenticity, as I talked about. So the fact that like, I'd prefer to be in a t-shirt right now, Casey, but I was like, okay, it's video. I kind of need to put on the big boy, I do have shorts on underneath, but I'll at least need to put on the collared shirt. So that's the doing the dance of authenticity I talked about.
Yeah.
How do we embrace the story or honor our ancestors, or how do we claim space and become the mentors we want to be? So those are the pieces that I just like to leave. And thanks for the opportunity for connecting.
Absolutely. First of all, any future 6 Degrees of Association podcast guests, feel free to wear a t-shirt. I'm cool with it. I know Lucas over at Big Red M, who runs the show here, he's cool with it too. You've been listening to the amazing Nathan Victoria. Still not sure how he finds time for all of it. He's the vice president of NextGen Association Management Company, serving as CEO of the Society for Personality Assessment, as we talked about. Also a PhD candidate at George Washington University. Just an absolute force, a breath of fresh air. Nathan, appreciate you. Appreciate your time. Is there anyone that you think can carry the torch? Who else in your network do you think we should, pick the brain of on a future episode?
Yeah, so I'm not gonna follow and just say one. There's a couple that I thought of. So one is, so she's in my DELP class, 1315, Michelle Mills Clement. For Text the Table, for those of you that are familiar, she was one of the founders of Text the Table. She's currently the CEO of the Chicago Association of Realtors, and just rolled off as board chair for Association Forum. So she is my sister that we fight a lot, but I've always valued her perspective. And then I do just want to mention too, I don't know if industry partners have traditionally been kind of guests.
Yes, suppliers to the industry are always welcome on our show. We want to hear their perspective too.
Perfect. So two that I would just, three, but really two. Moira Edwards with Ellipsis Consulting. So I've known Moira since 2020, or no, even before that. She did a database search beforehand. I brought her into SPA because, as we know, sometimes consultants can say things that we can't say as paid staff. So she did a great job of doing that. But why I value Moira is, even though I haven't engaged her since SPA, she's still there for a quick phone call, or, hey, Moira, I need this. Do you have any recommendations? And I really value that. Again, when I talked about sourcing and partnership, I value that with our association partners and vendors as well. And she's truly been the partner. Last, then, I'll mention one of the staff members, Meg Palumbo, who's the VP of Customer Strategy, but Pete Zimick, who's the CEO at Novi AMS. I will caveat, I'm on the user group, so that says something, but it's one of the few AMSs that I can honestly say I love. And I think a lot of it is Pete treats us like his board of directors, and he tries to run Novi as a association, not just a vendor. And I think that's probably a really interesting perspective that he'd probably be able to talk about. The other piece with Pete, he specifically has said throughout Novi, no venture capital. And that's one of those that, like, as an organ, like, he doesn't want to sell. And again, there's definitely value when vendors are bought out, the more resources. I've been with vendors that have been bought out, and I have seen the benefit. But I think within the AMS space, it's one of those I really value, and we've been on them since 5 years. We're bringing one other organization within the AMC onto them, and again, I think it's a really great product for certain use cases. But I think that philosophy of Pete would really be interesting to kind of hear from.
Yes, I want to hear more about that as well. And I know that that's an important topic because of all the mergers and acquisitions going on everywhere. Nathan, how can people best find you? Is dropping a LinkedIn thing the best way to go about it in the description? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, if you want to get in touch with Nathan, check out the description. Nathan, thank you again for your time.
Of course. Thank you, Casey. Thanks, everyone.